yes, call me crazy. In a world of steady and regular deaths of newspapers, we saw opportunity and started not just one, but 2 community newspapers. I know what you're thinking. We've all seen the headlines, like the one newspaper chain that announced they were closing down 160 community newspapers by the end of the first half of 2022. Or the Canadian company that announced it was closing 70 of their community newspapers by the end of the first half of 2023. And the professor of journalism, who was quoted in the Canadian CBC as saying, "That's no substantial loss. All those newspapers did was cover community events and spotlight features." Now think about your community. Is it not substantial? How many of you have a newspaper clipping hanging on your refrigerator? Yeah, I do. It has been there since 2016 when my husband was named Alum of the Year at his alma mater. I hunted that newspaper down, clipped it out, and it has been on the fridge now for 7 years. I see it every single day. I can touch it, feel it, I can still share it. That's a lot different than looking at something on a computer screen. Now, there are 3,143 counties in the United States, and half of them have at least one newspaper. But over 200 of them, 200 counties in the United States, don't have any newspaper at all. Now, that's like taking Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota and throwing a big cloud over it and saying, "No local news for you." Now, yes, you're thinking, well, they'll get their news on the internet, right? Well, first of all, you have to have good internet connection. And as of July of 2023, they have stated, the FCC has said there's over 8 million Americans who still don't have access to high-speed broadband. 8 million. PBS NewsHour did a segment in the summer of 2023 talking about how the loss of local newspapers has fueled the political divide in the United States. Again, the loss of local newspapers has fueled the political divide in the United States. Can you imagine? So as we look at all of this going online, right, it's like, where are we getting our local news? So our newspapers, we don't publish anything outside of our communities. We cover local information. We cover the Common Council, the school board, and yes, Friday night football games. Those are things that other places are not covering. So as we do this, you go back to 2005. Since 2005, which isn't that long ago, there's over 2,500 newspapers that have closed their doors. And every week, 2 more disappear. So it isn't any wonder that in 2018, when we announced that we were going to launch a newspaper in a city that already has a daily newspaper, people looked at us, walked away, thinking, is she nuts? Who would start a newspaper when newspapers were so obviously dying, dead, done? But are they dying, or is it opportunity? Opportunity. Now, I've worked in newspapers for a few decades, and I started in 1986 at the Arizona Republic in Accounts Receivable. The month I started, there was an article in the New York Times screaming, "Newspaper properties are hotter than ever." Over 70% of households in the United States had a newspaper delivered to them. 70%. Can you imagine? Any industry reaching 70%. So then 1990 rolls around and people started hearing about this thing called the internet. And 5 to 6 years later, there's sites like Craigslist, Monster, and AutoTrader that started becoming household names. But picture this, if you will. Me with my 80s hair and my headset on, sitting in a room of 100 coworkers, and we're all typing 100 words a minute, taking classified ads over the phone. And we're all watching this little red light on the wall, because as long as that red light was on, it meant people were on hold. And that on Friday afternoons, that light was on forever, and there were hundreds and hundreds of people waiting to place an ad. But as the internet grew and advertising for autos, employment, real estate, and merchandise started moving to cheaper online versions, that light stayed on shorter and shorter and shorter until it wasn't. What used to be 100 pages of advertising revenue supporting that news that was getting delivered was no longer. So as we go, and it's moving there, if you worked in newspapers around 2000 or so, we started hearing from our leaders within our own walls about how print was dead, digital is king. And they started spending all of their resources on building websites and purchasing digital components and properties. And what used to go into your newsroom and so forth was shifting. And they were pushing their advertisers, go digital, go digital, go digital. And so they did. And then people started getting the newspapers, and there was less and less and less in there because they started reducing what they had in the newsrooms. And don't get me wrong, those people that are working for daily newspapers in your community, they are working really, really hard. There's just not enough of them anymore. And when they have all of these newspapers and they're putting out daily papers, what happens? They have to share content. And so you may be in Milwaukee getting a story about Green Bay, or in Phoenix getting a story in Tucson. And let's face it, if it's not your community, is that news really substantial to you? You want to hear about what's going on in your community. Our newspapers, that's all we cover. If it happens outside of our boundaries, it doesn't make the paper. We cover the Common Council, the school board, Friday night football, the volleyball games. We let people know what's going on in their community. We don't publish letters to the editor. We don't publish editorials. We cover the local news, and we let our readers decide and make up their own minds. That's a big difference. So as we're going through this and we're building these, like I said, I worked in newspaper for a long time. And my last couple positions were here, actually, and I had 2 dailies and a weekly. Now, the surprising thing was that when I spoke with people in the community that had the daily and the weekly, both owned by the same company, most thought of the weekly as their community newspaper because it had all those press releases and spotlight features about what was going on. It had the press releases from the organizations and the businesses. And when I would point out, well, you do realize that for your school board and your government news, it's in the daily, they just kind of went, yeah, I guess. But in their mind, the perception was they were being kept informed about what was going on in their community. And that is what is important. As they're pushing things going digital, this is where we started seeing the demise of our fourth estate. Now, the fourth estate is the watchdog role that the press plays in our communities. It lets us know what our government is doing, what our school board is up. And when you don't have that, that is when you start seeing cracks in your community. You'll start seeing taxes go up. We report on what is going on so you know what is your common council is up, where are your taxes going, what is the school board doing. These are things that are very, very important. So again, why would anyone start a newspaper? After my second reduction in force from newspapers, I was fortunate to work with a coalition that helped people overcome barriers and reach self-sufficiency. And what I was aware of is, what do I know? How do I know what I don't know I should know? Again, how do I know what I should know? If I don't know, I should know it. And this became very apparent because as I worked with these 24 agencies, one of the things I would ask them is, how does one find out about this program? Where do you find out about these resources? And ultimately, they would say, it's on our website, it's on Facebook, and I would go looking for it. And even though I knew what I was looking for, I couldn't find it. So how are you supposed to find out the things that you should know, that you don't know, but you need to know in your community? Community newspapers. Local is the key. We need to be able to let people know what's going on in their community. So it made sense. It's opportunity. As we go on, we're not the only crazy people out there. There are a lot of people picking up the reins and bringing back local newspapers to their hometowns, just like we did. They are trying to fill the void. Now, you don't need to be a journalist or a reporter in order to begin a newspaper. I wasn't. I worked in advertising my entire career. All you need to do is find a few people who are passionate about closing the void of local news and doing that. It is an opportunity. Newspapers are not dying. Newspapers are needed. And I'd ask you to pick up the reins and join me in making more informed communities.